The radio call came at hour 6. 3 words that would echo through NATO command channels and eventually reach briefing rooms in Washington. Exercise suspended immediately. Those 3 words ended what was supposed to be a routine multinational training event and began a controversy that forced uncomfortable admissions from the most powerful military alliance on Earth. What happened in those 6 hours before the suspension exposed a truth that NATO planners had never formally acknowledged. A truth about physical capability gaps between allied forces so severe that a standard assessment designed by one nation became a mass casualty event when applied to another. The nation that designed the assessment was the United Kingdom. The nation that experienced the casualties was the United States. And the gap between what British forces considered a moderate physical challenge and what American forces could actually accomplish created a crisis that required emergency medical intervention and produced after-action reports that senior officers attempted to classify. By the end of this video, you will understand exactly what happened during this exercise, why a physical assessment that British soldiers completed routinely became impossible for American soldiers to finish, and what this catastrophic failure reveals about the hidden reality of NATO interoperability that official documents rarely discuss. The exercise was conducted under the NATO Response Force framework. The specific designation remains sensitive, so I will refer to it simply as the exercise throughout this video. What is not sensitive is what happened, because the events were witnessed by personnel from multiple nations and the lessons learned were distributed across NATO training commands. The location was northern Germany, a training area selected for its demanding terrain and realistic conditions. 12 NATO nations contributed ground forces. The exercise would last 3 weeks and include multiple evaluation phases covering tactical proficiency, combined arms integration, and fundamental soldier capabilities. The British were assigned responsibility for Phase 4, the physical capability assessment. This assignment reflected British expertise in demanding infantry standards and their reputation for rigorous selection and training. The assessment would evaluate loaded march capability, the fundamental ability of infantry to move under combat load across challenging terrain. This capability is considered essential for ground forces regardless of national origin. The assumption was that professional infantry from NATO nations would demonstrate roughly comparable capability on a standardized test. Let me describe the assessment parameters because understanding exactly what was asked is essential to understanding what went wrong. The loaded march covered 30 kilometers, approximately 18.5 miles. The load was standardized at 25 kilograms, roughly 55 pounds, plus individual weapon and water. The time limit was 7 hours. The terrain included paved roads, improved trails, and cross-country segments through forested and open ground. Weather would be whatever conditions existed on assessment day. No modifications would be made for precipitation, temperature, or wind. British planners who designed this assessment considered it moderate by their standards. Royal Marine training culminates in a 30-mile march across Dartmoor in 8 hours. British parachute regiment selection includes loaded march standards that exceed what this assessment demanded. From the British perspective, 30 kilometers in 7 hours, with 55 pounds represented an achievable standard for trained infantry. They deliberately set the bar below British baseline requirements to accommodate the range of NATO participants. This reasonable British assumption collided with the reality that exercise planners had not adequately researched. The assumption that professional NATO infantry share roughly comparable loaded march capability was wrong. The gap between what British forces consider baseline and what other forces can achieve is not marginal. It is categorical. The assessment began at 0600 hours. Weather conditions were suboptimal but not extreme. Temperature around 6 degrees Celsius. Intermittent rain. Moderate wind. Visibility adequate for safe movement. British personnel assessed conditions as typical autumn weather. Some American personnel later characterized conditions as unnecessarily harsh, a characterization that itself revealed the philosophical gap between the forces. All national contingents departed simultaneously from a common start point. The first hour proceeded normally. Movement rates were appropriate. Formation integrity was maintained. Observer teams positioned along the route reported no significant difficulties. If the assessment had ended at hour 1, no story would exist to tell. Hour 2 introduced the first indications of differential performance. British forces maintained their departure pace with no visible increase in exertion. American forces maintained the same pace, but visible strain had increased disproportionately to the distance covered. Soldiers were breathing harder than the effort should have required. Gait patterns were becoming less efficient. The body language suggested soldiers fighting their loads rather than carrying them naturally. If you are finding this analysis valuable and want to understand the real differences between NATO force capabilities, subscribe right now. Next week I am covering why certain special operations forces maintain selection standards that others consider physically impossible and what makes those standards achievable for soldiers who train appropriately. But right now, let me tell you what happened when hour 3 arrived, because this is when the exercise began its transformation from evaluation to emergency. Hour 3 produced the first American casualty, requiring medical attention. A sergeant with 8 years of service and multiple deployments experienced severe bilateral leg cramping that made continued movement impossible. Medical personnel evaluated him at a checkpoint. He was not injured in any traumatic sense. His muscles had simply failed disproportionately to the demand. He was withdrawn from the assessment. Within the following 90 minutes, 6 more American soldiers were withdrawn for similar presentations. Cramping, early indicators of heat illness despite moderate temperature. Blistering severe enough to impair walking. Fatigue exceeding what the distance and load should have produced. Each case was individually explicable, as a soldier having a bad day. Collectively, the pattern suggested something systematic was occurring. British observer teams began documenting the disparity because it exceeded anything they had anticipated. Their soldiers were completing the same route under the same conditions, carrying the same loads with minimal difficulty. American soldiers were failing at rates that suggested the assessment might not be completable by the American contingent. Hour 4 confirmed this concern. American casualties accelerated. The medical checkpoint at the 15-kilometer mark, slightly past the halfway point, became overwhelmed with soldiers requiring evaluation. Medical personnel who had planned for routine minor injuries were suddenly managing what one British medic later described as a mass casualty situation without combat. Let me share specific observations from medical personnel because their clinical perspective illuminates what happened. A British Army physiotherapist assigned to the checkpoint described the American casualties as consistent with soldiers exceeding their condition capacity. Their bodies were not prepared for the specific demand being placed on them. The load was not excessive by any objective standard. The distance was not extreme. The pace was not unreasonable, but the combination exceeded what their training had prepared them to sustain. She noted that the injury patterns were preventable. These were not acute injuries from accidents or terrain hazards. These were overuse injuries developing in real time because soldiers were operating beyond their preparation level. Their cardiovascular systems were adequate. Their mental toughness was not in question. The limiting factor was specific musculoskeletal conditioning for loaded movement that their training had not fully developed. By hour 5, the American battalion commander was facing a decision that no officer wants to confront. Nearly 20% of his soldiers had been withdrawn for medical reasons. An unknown additional percentage were continuing but showing signs of imminent failure. The completion rate projection suggested that fewer than half of his soldiers would finish the assessment if it continued to its conclusion. He requested a conference with the exercise commander, a Norwegian general officer responsible for overall exercise conduct. The conversation that followed was reportedly tense. The American commander argued that conditions were more severe than anticipated and that allowances should be made. The Norwegian commander noted that British, Norwegian, German, and other contingents were completing the assessment at expected rates. Conditions were identical for all participants. The differential outcome required explanation beyond environmental factors. The discussion reached an impasse that required resolution from the assessment control element. The British colonel responsible for Phase 4 evaluation joined the conference. His input would become the most controversial aspect of the entire exercise. He stated simply that the assessment standard was set below British training baselines specifically to be achievable by Allied forces. If the standard was not achievable by American forces, that revealed a capability gap that needed to be documented rather than accommodated. Modifying the assessment to enable American completion would undermine the interoperability data the exercise was designed to produce. The American commander reportedly responded that his soldiers were not prepared for British standards and should not be evaluated against them. The British colonel reportedly responded that they were not being evaluated against British standards. They were being evaluated against NATO standards that the British had deliberately set lower than their own national standards. This exchange captured the core issue. The British believed they had set an accessible standard. The Americans discovered the standard exceeded their preparation. The gap between British understanding of accessible and American actual capability was the entire problem. At hour 6, the exercise commander made the decision to suspend American participation in the assessment. The justification was medical prudence. Continuing the march would likely produce additional casualties that could be prevented through suspension. The assessment had already generated sufficient data to document the capability variance. Further damage to American soldiers was not necessary to establish what had already been established. The suspension was executed immediately. American soldiers still on the route were transported to the exercise base. Those who had completed portions of the march received credit for distance covered but did not receive completion certificates. The assessment continued for other national contingents, most of whom finished at rates consistent with British expectations. Let me provide the final statistics because the numbers tell a story that narrative alone cannot fully capture. British completion rate exceeded 96%, Norwegian completion rate exceeded 94%, German completion rate exceeded 91%, Polish completion rate was approximately 87%, French completion rate was approximately 83%. Italian completion rate was approximately 78%. American completion rate was 0. The contingent was suspended before any soldier had completed the full distance. At the time of suspension, approximately 15 kilometers into the 30-kilometer march, casualty rates had reached approximately 22%, with projections suggesting the rate would increase significantly over the remaining distance. The disparity between 0% American completion and 96% British completion on the same assessment under the same conditions with the same loads represents the starkest possible illustration of a capability gap. This was not marginal underperformance. This was categorical failure on a standard that Allies completed routinely. The after-action process was extensive and produced findings that have influenced subsequent NATO exercise design. Let me walk through the key conclusions because they illuminate systemic issues that extend beyond this specific exercise. The first finding addressed standard variance across NATO forces. The exercise documented that no common physical capability baseline exists across NATO infantry forces. National training programs produce national capabilities that vary dramatically. British training produces soldiers who can complete loaded marches at rates and distances that significantly exceed what American training produces. This variance was not previously quantified at this scale. The second finding addressed preparation and notification. American forces received exercise parameters months before execution. The loaded march assessment was described in the warning order. However, American training in the intervening period did not specifically target the announced standards. Units continued training according to existing programs rather than adapting to exercise requirements. The assumption that existing conditioning would suffice proved incorrect. The third finding addressed equipment adaptation. The assessment used standardized equipment, specifically British pattern Bergens, to ensure fair comparison. American soldiers carrying unfamiliar packs experienced additional difficulty because their bodies had not adapted to British equipment characteristics. The physiological cost of the march was amplified by equipment mismatch. The fourth finding addressed medical planning. Exercise. Medical resources were scaled for anticipated casualty rates based on British experience with similar assessments. Actual American casualty rates exceeded planning assumptions by approximately 300%. Future exercises must account for capability variance when sizing medical resources. The fifth finding, perhaps most significant, addressed interoperability assumptions. NATO operational planning assumes forces from member nations can operate together effectively. This assumption implicitly includes physical capability, interoperability. If forces cannot maintain common movement rates under combat load, tactical integration is compromised. The exercise demonstrated that current American infantry may not be able to maintain pace with British infantry during loaded movement operations. This has implications for combined operations planning. The formal findings were carefully worded to avoid embarrassing any specific nation. The informal discussions that circulated through military channels were more direct. British officers privately expressed surprise at the scale of American failure. American officers privately expressed frustration that the exercise used standards their training had not prepared them for. German and Norwegian officers noted that the exercise had revealed interoperability challenges that planning documents do not acknowledge. Let me share perspectives from individual soldiers because their experiences illuminate what aggregate statistics cannot capture. A U.S. Army specialist, who was withdrawn at kilometer 13, described the experience as the hardest thing he had ever done, and he did not even finish. He said he had considered himself fit. He ran regularly. He lifted weights. He completed every Army physical fitness requirement without difficulty. But the loaded march demanded something different from general fitness. It demanded specific conditioning he had not developed. He described the Bergen as fighting him throughout the march. Every step required effort to stabilize the load. His shoulders burned from the first hour. His hips ached from weight distribution he was not accustomed to. His feet developed hot spots that became blisters. He wanted to continue. He did not quit. His body failed. That distinction mattered to him. He did not ring a bell. He was carried off. A British Royal Marine corporal, who completed the assessment in under 6 hours, offered perspective from the successful side. He said the march was nothing special for him. Similar to training marches, he completed monthly. The weight was familiar. The distance was manageable. The pace was comfortable. He was surprised when he saw Americans being withdrawn because, from his position, nothing about the assessment seemed particularly difficult. He noted that watching the American struggle created mixed feelings. He felt sympathy for soldiers clearly giving maximum effort. He also felt something like confusion. How could professional soldiers from the world's most powerful military find this march so challenging? He had assumed American infantry would be comparable to British infantry in basic physical capability. The assessment showed this assumption was wrong. A German Bundeswehr Hauptmann serving as an observer offered an analytical perspective. He said, "The exercise revealed something that NATO prefers not to discuss. Alliance cohesion depends partly on the polite fiction that member forces share comparable capabilities. Exercises that expose dramatic variances threaten this fiction. Some officers prefer not to know what the exercise demonstrated. Others argue that operational planning requires honest capability assessment. His assessment was that future exercises face a choice. Either standardize assessments at levels all members can achieve, which means setting standards below what capable forces can accomplish, or accept that standardized assessments will produce differential outcomes that require explanation. There is no option that avoids either lowered standards or exposed disparities." The American military's internal response to the exercise has influenced ongoing discussions about physical training standards. The specific changes implemented remain partly internal, but the direction is visible. Increased emphasis on loaded march capability in some units. Revised assessment standards that more closely approach Allied levels. Equipment evaluation focused on load-bearing optimization. Whether these changes will close the gap with British forces remains to be seen. The British advantage in loaded march capability reflects decades of institutional investment in this specific skill. American forces are attempting to develop comparable capability over much shorter timeline. Progress is occurring, but parity remains distant. The broader implications extend beyond loaded march performance. If American forces cannot maintain pace with British forces on basic foot movement, what other capability gaps might exist? The exercise demonstrated one specific disparity. Other disparities may exist in other domains that have not been similarly tested. The exercise was valuable precisely because it revealed what would otherwise remain hidden. NATO exercises exist to identify interoperability challenges before operational necessity exposes them. Better to discover capability gaps in training than in combat. The exercise fulfilled this function, though the discovery was uncomfortable for American forces involved. The embarrassment of training failure is vastly preferable to the catastrophe of operational failure. The relationship between American and British forces remains strong despite this episode. Professional militaries learn from failures rather than defending them. American forces are studying what the British do differently and adapting where adaptation is possible. British forces are contributing to this adaptation through exchange programs and shared training. The failure is producing learning that would not occur through success. If you found this analysis valuable, subscribe now and hit the notification bell. Next week, I am covering the physical selection standards across NATO Special Operations Forces and revealing which nations maintain requirements that others consider impossible. The week after that, I am examining cases where American training standards exceeded Allied capabilities because capability gaps exist in multiple directions across different domains. Drop your comments below. Tell me about your own experiences with multinational exercises if you have served. Tell me whether you believe NATO should standardize physical requirements across member forces or accept national variation as inevitable. These perspectives shape future content and they matter for understanding how military alliances actually function. If you learned something from this video, share it with someone who appreciates understanding the real challenges of coalition military operations. Not the diplomatic version where all allies are equivalent, but the operational reality where different nations bring different capabilities shaped by different training philosophies. The exercise went wrong because assumptions were wrong. Planners assumed comparable capability across NATO infantry forces. The assessment demonstrated this assumption was false. American forces could not complete a standard that British forces found unremarkable. The gap was not explained by conditions or circumstances. The gap was explained by training that produces different outcomes. The American soldiers who failed this assessment were not inferior soldiers in any character sense. They were soldiers whose training had prepared them for different standards. Meeting American standards, they were excellent soldiers. Meeting British standards, they were inadequate. The failure was institutional, not individual. Their training had not given them what the assessment demanded. They could not produce what they had not been given. This is the essential lesson of the exercise. Soldiers can only do what training prepares them to do. Training that does not include demanding loaded march progressions at British intensities does not produce capability at British levels. This is not mysterious. This is mechanical. Training determines capability. Different training produces different capability. The exercise measured capability. The measurement revealed difference. The exercise that went wrong was an exercise that went right in the most important sense. It revealed truth that pleasant exercises obscure. It demonstrated limits that comfortable training does not expose. It forced conversations that polite interoperability documents avoid. The wrong was valuable precisely because it was wrong. NATO is stronger for knowing what this exercise revealed. American forces are adapting based on what they learned. British forces are contributing to that adaptation. The alliance is more capable because capability gaps are now acknowledged rather than assumed away. The painful discovery produces beneficial response. Until next time, remember that exercises exist to learn. Learning sometimes requires failure. The exercise that goes wrong is sometimes the exercise that provides the most valuable lessons. This exercise went wrong for American soldiers. The wrongness produced learning that could not occur through success. That learning is the exercise's permanent contribution regardless of how uncomfortable it was to produce. The British load test was not designed to break American soldiers. It was designed to evaluate infantry capability. American soldiers broke because their capability did not match what the test demanded. The breaking was diagnostic, not punitive. The diagnosis enables treatment. Treatment is now occurring. The American military is adapting because it now knows adaptation is necessary. Without the exercise going wrong, this necessity might remain hidden. The comfortable assumption of interoperability would continue. The capability gap would persist unaddressed. The wrong made visible what right would have concealed. That visibility enables response. That concealment would prevent the exercise went wrong. The going wrong served the purpose that going right would not have served. That is the paradox of rigorous training assessment. Failure produces learning. Success may not. The failure at this exercise produced learning about NATO interoperability that decades of successful exercises had not produced. The failure was more valuable than success would have been. British load test revealed American limitations. The revelation enables American improvement. Improvement serves American interests. Improvement serves alliance interests. The painful revelation produces beneficial outcome. That is why exercises must be allowed to go wrong. That is why capability gaps must be exposed rather than accommodated. That is what happened here. That is why it matters.